tripod is going to be capable of keeping up with me as I move from side to side, but Will, certainly we appreciate it. The audio is running great, so we appreciate his efforts and his equipment. He brought his own equipment today to record this for us. So I think they kind of went out to hustle up the folks outside, and so we're going to get started again. And the topic of this session is the age of the earth. And of course, that's critical, as we're going to see, to either or, whichever camp of origins you want to find yourself in, the age of the earth is critical. Where's our light guy? There you go. There he is. He says, I'm running behind. The question of how we're going to view this, information, people are either going to take it as a joke, and again, the scientists at the Oxford Round Table, especially the professor from the University of West Virginia at Parkersburg in 2006, he was a geologist, and he took it as a huge joke. He was very uncomplimentary of my intelligence and virtually any other thing that he could insult. But the question is it scientific information? Is it serious science, or is it just making up a straw or a case that really isn't there? That depends on our worldviews, as I said. What a worldview is, it's suppositions, which is they can be true, they can be false, they can be neutral, but they're presuppositions which we hold about the basic makeup of our world. In other words, why we're here, where we're going, what's going to happen after life. And there are, as I said earlier, about 5 worldviews: naturalism, pantheism, theism, spiritualism, and polytheism, and postmodernism. Now, again, of those, you've got the 2 that are probably the most popular or the most commonly held are naturalism. That's the idea that the Big Bang occurred, nothing exploded, and here we are. Through random series of accidents, we have achieved over billions of years the current condition, and we are on the move again. We are still changing. We are still evolving. It's not done yet. And or theism, of course, which is that God revealed himself to us in his holy word, the Bible, and in the beginning he created, and that creation was not that long ago. So the way you accept this evidence is going to depend upon, and I hope that there are some people that that this may challenge your normally accepted view of things, because it should change people's mind if they're willing to have an open mind and say, I could see how that could, an atheist that I knew some years ago and decided that he was going to disprove the creation account by studying the Bible. And he studied himself out of atheism. And I believe that that's, he was a scientist, and I believe that that's when you take a serious view and say, I'm going to examine with a critical view these things, and you, like I said, you might be scared at where you end up. It may not be where you thought you would go. So the worldview has a big part to play in this idea of whether the earth is young or old. Well, why does it matter? Well, for the creationists, the Bible is the authority for our answer, and it gives no indication of how old the earth is. It doesn't give us a number. It doesn't say this many thousands years old, this many millions years. It doesn't say. But what it does say in Exodus 20 verse 11 and 31 verse 17, for in 6 days God created heaven and earth and all that in them is. And so it says, it makes the statement that God created everything that there is in 6 days. Now, of course, there's always the concept, well, what's a day? Is a day a million years? Well, the Lord, a day with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. Well, that doesn't mean that God, when he says day, he means 1,000 years. Simply means God doesn't care. God looks at time like we look at that wall. He sees the beginning, he sees the end, and he can be in any one of it at any time he chooses. All right? It doesn't matter with God. He's not time-bound like we are. And so for the creationists, and of course Jesus said from the beginning that he created them male and female. Now again, that's from the original creation, not the original creation of Adam and Eve. But that was from the original creation. Of course, that's Mark 10 verse 6. And so, when Jesus said that God created male and female, that's humans, from the beginning, that's of the original creation, Man, of course, was created on day 5, which is very, very close to the beginning. And so individuals who try to put between verse 1 and verse 2 in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and they try to put 1 billion or 2 or 3 billion years in that gap, are stretching tremendously. And I believe they do great violence, and they make Jesus a liar, as far as I'm concerned. Well, why does it matter for the evolutionists? Time is essential for evolutionary scientists. For the naturalists, for the atheists, they have to have time or the show's over. The show comes to an end if they don't have billions of years of time. The evolution of living things by natural selection and slow gradual changes would take vast eons, unquestionable. At the rate we know living things mutate, it would take eons of time. So absolutely, to have the geologic time scale, to have the tree of life, these concepts, you have to have vast periods of time in order for them to happen. George Wald, a 1967 Nobel Prize winner in medicine, said this: "Time is the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The possible probable, and the probable a virtual certainty. One only has to wait. Time itself performs miracles." Folks, that's why time is necessary to the naturalist. He has to have it. If he doesn't have it, his whole house of cards has collapsed. He's got nothing to build anything on. And so certainly the time is critical, and that's why it's important. Now, as we look at this, and this is from a biology textbook. It's the biology textbook that I used when I was teaching for advanced placement biology. But the Campbell and Rees, so the 6th edition, says this: "Darwinian evolution requires an ancient Earth. Evidence for an ancient Earth comes from the enormous amounts of time needed to build up the layers of sedimentary rock we can see in cliff face and canyons." And so, they flat out admit, this is at the beginning of the chapter on evolution, time has to be present if the evolution of life is going to occur. And again, they use the evidence of, well, look at the rocks. You drive down the road where they make a road cut. Well, look at those layers. It takes millions of years to form, 1 inch of rock. So how do we answer that? And that's the question that we've got before us today, if I don't fall and break my crazy neck. All right, support for an old Earth. Well, the basic idea comes from something that is termed uniformitarianism. And this is the idea that the same processes, geological processes we see going on around us today, weathering, frost wedging, heating, cooling, those are the things that have always happened. And so when we look out at, you put a rock out in the rain and a little bit of chemical weathering starts to occur and it starts to erode away or it starts to break down as the minerals enter dissolved and so on. And those are the same processes that have always worked on the rocks that are on the earth. And so when we see out in California right now, we're watching where the fires burned off the vegetation, and now we're getting the El Nino rains. We're getting mudslides. Well, that's depositing new layers of rock, according to the geologists of the world. That's laying down, and it takes millions and millions of years of floods in order to build up enough to actually become a layer of rock like we see. So uniformitarianism is critical. The idea that they become layers, stratigraphy, it's called, this is the layering of the rocks visible in Earth's surface. And geologists have to have those rocks to be always old to young. So the rocks at the bottom of the Grand Canyon should be older than the younger rocks on top because the ones at the top were laid down last, okay, according to the standard uniformitarianism processes. And so when we look at these types of things, the question is how we go about deciding which rock up there is older. This is out of my rock collection, and I will tell you, my wife will tell you, she can tell the folks from Belington, anywhere I go, I don't go unless I come back with a pile of rocks. She says I've got rocks in my head, which is probably true, but I've got a basement full of rocks. And these are rocks. One of those rocks, according to the standard evolutionary geologic time scale, is about it's about 2.5 billion years old. The other one's about probably 1,000 years old. Can you tell which one it is? Which is the 2.5 billion year old rock from the Cambrian layer out in Colorado where it's exposed? I'd say most of you can't tell, right? Because it's not anything that we can see when we look at rocks. That's not how they date rocks, all right? there are two dating methods whenever it comes to geology. They are called relative and absolute. Now, relative date simply refers to the idea that, well, if we think that this layer of rocks is this old and we find a fossil in a layer right above that, then we should be able to make the assumption that the layer of rock, if we say that this is 2.5 billion years old, then this one probably is, maybe 2 billion years old. And so if there's a fossil in that layer, that's how old that particular rock is. Or that's when that fossil lived, that's how old the fossil is going to be, and the rock because it's going to be younger. Then there is what they term absolute dating. Now this takes in things like counting tree rings, which is pretty good. We've all done that. Okay, we've seen a large tree cut down, and we go, well, let's count the rings. Let's count the growth rings. And is that a pretty good indicator of how old the tree was? Yeah, it's actually quite good. Okay, and so that's an absolute dating method. Okay, meaning that every year, spring and summer, you get lots of growth or lots of rain in the spring. You get a lot of sapwood that grows great big xylem tissues. Then in the summer, the amount of water decreases, and so the xylem tissues are going to be smaller, the tubes are going to be smaller, and you get these annual growth rings. That is an absolute and gives a much more exact age. The relative gives general ages. And that's the method by which they operate. And of course, we'll talk about radiometric dating, and that's what the chart is referring to, how radioactive substances can break down to what's called their half-life, which is the decay of the neutrons in the nucleus, and that's about a 2-hour explanation. So how do we date rocks? It's not by their appearance. It's not by how they look. It's not by their petrologic character. In other words, the layers of, the makeup of the layers, in other words, whether they're flattened out or whether the crystals are in the same orientation in the rock. It's not by the minerals that are in them. We don't date them by the mineral content. Their structural features, whether or not they have, realize there are rocks that float. Anyone ever seen a rock float? Went out to Colorado to Wyoming a few years ago, and went up to this lake, and here's rocks floating. Of course, I picked up 3 or 4, and they're in my basement right now. Okay? They're pumice. They are rocks that they came out of a volcano, they were puffed up full of air, and throw them in a body of water, and they just bob along because they're full of air spaces. And so it's not by their structural features like those puffs. It's not by the rocks that are adjacent to them. In other words, left, right, or up, or down. It's not by their vertical superpositioning. That's in the stratigraphy, the layers. Because one of the things we do know now, geologists have, and I've had 20-some hours of graduate level geology, okay? And I can confirm this is exactly true. Whenever they say, well, the older rocks are supposed to be under the younger rocks, if they find a situation where they believe it's the reverse of that, guess what they do? Well, that's called a non-disjunction. Something happened to flip all those rocks upside down, and because, well, we know that this rock, this has got this fossil in it. And so it's not their superpositioning. It's not by radiometric dating. All right? It's not by radiometric dating because, well, there's several reasons. Because of that, we'll talk about some of those. Not by any physical characteristic. It's not by their total fossil content. It is done by the process of index fossils. They determine how old rocks are by the fossils of living things that they find in them. All right? When they find an index fossil above or below a layer of rocks, they have decided they know when evolution caused this particular living thing, this life form, to come along. Well, this was back before the age of the dinosaurs. And so that means it's 289 million years ago. So this fossil, because it's in a layer right above the dinosaurs, or right below the dinosaurs, then that means it's at least 300 million years. They use index fossils. So what's an index fossil? Okay, these are forms of life which existed during limited periods of geologic time and thus are used as guides to the age of rocks in which they are preserved. This is the U.S. Geologic Survey. Of course, this is a government agency, and they're not going to put out stuff that isn't absolutely right. Well, oops, I didn't say that. No, we're not going there, folks, okay? But that's the standard geologic answer. That's how we date rocks, by the fossil, the content, the index fossils that are found in them. And so when they found, for example, coelacanth, and this fossil over here that you see on the screen right now, this is coelacanth, and coelacanth is a lobed fin fish. And according to evolution, it was one of the transition fossils between fish, true fish, swimming in the water, and the amphibians, which crawl up on land but like it moist, like it salamanders and things like that. And this lobe fin fish was supposed to have been the one that one day just decided he's got big, long, fleshy lobes on his fins, and he's going to crawl out of the water and evolve by mutations over millions of years to become the salamanders. And he was an index fossil for hundreds of years. He made a bad mistake, though. He's not extinct. They're still alive. Unchanged over 280 plus million years of evolution. They're still the same fish that they were, as long as they've been here. So index fossils are certainly, that's the method by which they date these rocks. The only chronometric scale applicable in geologic history for the stratigraphic classifications of rocks and for dating geologic events exactly, notice that, exactly. They can say that because, well, we know when things evolved. We know exactly how long it was ago when these life forms evolved from one thing into another. No, they don't. Okay? Is furnished by the fossils. Owing to the irreversibility of evolution, they offer an unambiguous timescale for the relative age determinations and for worldwide correlation of ages. Do you realize that supposedly they can go to the Grand Canyon, you have almost a mile layer of rocks? Well, surely we have all of the layers of the history of the earth there. Wrong. About 80% of the earth's history is missing from the Grand Canyon. How do they know that? Well, they found it over in France somewhere. They found the other layers that somehow got from the Grand Canyon to France. Well, where'd they go from in the Grand Canyon? Well, we don't know, but they're gone. Okay, because they don't agree with the evolution of life. They use the evolution of life as their standard for dating these things. All right, that's how we get the old age for the earth, is not because of anything that we find from looking at a rock. All right, it just doesn't work that way. The circular reasoning of evolution then, in geologic dating, we use index fossils to determine the geologic age of rocks. Then guess what we do? Decide how old the fossil is. When did this thing live? Well, we use the rock's age. Oh, wait a minute. You just used the fossil to prove how old the rock was. Now you're going to use the rock to prove how old the fossil is? That's what you call arguing in a circle. They argue to suit themselves, basically. And it's bad. It's bad. Index fossils in the rocks supposedly demonstrate the evolution of life and prove that the earth is old. Well, obviously, support for the old age of the earth. Again, they do use radiometric dating, carbon-14. I had an opportunity to talk the other evening, Thursday evening, with the news anchor from the Harrisonburg TV station. And he asked me, well, and he was a nice gentleman. Don't get me wrong. He wasn't accusing me or anything. He wasn't being disagreeable. He was just being honestly curious. He said, doesn't carbon-14 dating prove the earth is millions and millions of years old? Well, I said, no, it doesn't. Because W.F. Libby, who first discovered the concept of carbon-14 dating, says 50,000 years is the maximum time that you can date with carbon-14 dating. Now, that's a long ways from 4.5 billion years. All right, 50,000 years. Most scientists say it's 10, 15,000 years, maybe. That's pushing it. And even then, the number of, what I call dancing. They dance around with a lot of things to get these ages. Do you realize that if I want to determine the age of something, and I want to send it to one of these radiometric dating labs, and I can give you the names of 2 or 3 if you'd like them. Beta Analytics in Miami, Florida does radiometric dating, carbon-14 dating of living tissue, of tissue of any type. It's got to be organic. So this, because carbon-14 only works on things that are alive or were alive at one point. They will ask you when you ship them the sample, well, how old do you think this thing is? They want to know before they start working on it how old it is. And I'm not joking. They have to know that because they're not sure the numbers they're going to get are even right, And if they don't match what you've already decided how old it is, then they throw that number out and start again until they get what you want. Laugh if you like. It's true. It's sad, but it's true. Because they dated the Iceman, that fossilized human they found in the Austrian, Italian Alps. They dated that poor fellow 4 times before they realized that they had decided that it was younger than what it was, because he had a bronze axe, so he's from the Bronze Age, which is 3,500 years ago. But the radiometric dating kept coming back 5,000 years, 5,000 years, 5,000 years. No, that's wrong. No, that's wrong. No, that's wrong. They weren't interested in the numbers. They were interested in somebody agreeing with what they already decided. All right? They do that over and over again. They actually request, how old is this sample, before they will test it, because they want to make their math come out to your answer. Now, that seems insane, but that's what it is. We look at uranium-238 to lead, rubidium to strontium. These are all the other methods that are normally used to support billions and billions of years of dating. In other words, that's how they date these things. So if this isn't how we date rocks, it's not the way we date rocks, because there are so many assumptions that have to be made in all of these radiometric methods. Number one, they have to know the original conditions at the time of zero. When a rock is at time zero, whenever a rock is born, that is when it first hardens into whatever state it was. So if magma comes out of a volcano, when it cools and hardens, that's its birthday. That's when it became a rock. Same thing would be true of sedimentary rock, where it's been laid down and it's finally coalesced, it's finally settled into a solid state. That's its birthday. Okay, well, you have to know the condition at that time. You have to know whether there's any contamination. Now, contamination refers to the materials that they're going to test the sample of. In other words, all of these radioactive materials can either be the original parent material, and right beside it you can have some of the half-life material already degraded. And so the question is, what was the original condition of the original rock? The original formation of the sample, was the collection and processing of the sample done? Do you realize that you get a little bit of dirt inside of one of these samples and you just screwed the whole thing up? All right? Not only that, there has to be a constant decay rate of this radioactive material. It has to be proven that well, how do you know that? Well, you have to go back and watch it for 2.5 billion years. Well, duh. Okay? They assume that there was no change in the decay rate. They don't know that for a fact. And then the calibration has to be done correctly. Now, by calibration, I literally mean they will adjust their numbers up or down depending on I think this is a 3 billion year old rock. Well, their numbers come out way short of that. They just tinker with the math. Remember, with numbers, you can prove anything with numbers, right? Well, check with the IRS. They'll prove that. Okay. But they will calibrate. They will calibrate the age, and they'll say, well, this rock, the date comes back too young, too old, but we're going to calibrate it using this other rock that comes from this same area. And so calibration, none of these are testable. None of these can be proven. And they all are assumptions that are absolutely essential to the process. The information from this slide came from the Encyclopedia Britannica. You may have heard of it, back when they actually did print versions, okay, back in the Stone Age. But this is a quote directly out of it. If a certain radiometric age proves to be wrong, no, wait a minute, it's 100%, how can it be wrong? Well, if it proves to be wrong, the error stems from one of 3 sources: the measurement, human or the machine, the interpretation. What do you mean the interpretation? They actually interpret these numbers to make them, if they want an old number, they can interpret to get it. Being sure that the source is right. The assumptions made. There's the closed system. There's the sample free of the daughter elements. And this was from the 1978 version of edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, page 504. So they have built in, they acknowledge that their absolute method of dating is nothing but a house of cards. They tell you that up front. And you can go to the Beta Analytics website, and I've spent the last week or so preparing to write an article researching, and they tell you every one of these things. Well, you got to be careful now. We don't contaminate the sample. Well, you got to be careful that you tell us how old the rock is, because that's important for us to make the right interpretation on it. Now, wait a minute. This is supposed to be so accurate, and you're expecting me to tell you how old this thing is? Well, and they won't do this process unless you tell them that information. And then if the answer comes back wrong, well, there must have been some daughter elements in it, or there must have been a change in the decay rate. And we can't prove what the decay rate is of anything. We know what it is right this second, or was 100 years ago, or whenever they first started analyzing things. But does that mean it's always been that rate? No proof of that whatsoever. Well, then let's look at the evidence for a young earth. We don't have much time left, do we? Eddie up here. All right, we're going way too fast. Well, biblical chronology. In Genesis chapter 5, God tells us the individuals. Adam begat Seth, Enos, Cainan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. That brings us up to Noah. It gives us the dates of each of them, when, who begat whom, and what date they were at. Okay, we've got that information. Now, did God give us that in order to tell us exactly how old the earth was? No. He didn't provide that information for that purpose. But is it a relative indication? Absolutely. Then you go to Genesis chapter 11, and then you go to Matthew chapter 1, and so on. So we have biblical chronology that is helpful to us in getting an idea. And all of those numbers don't go back that far. Well, then you have historical chronology. The historical community, has now dated and agree that David is a historical character. It used to be, from David to, David was considered okay, then Moses. Now they're finding some archaeological discoveries to say, yes, Abraham was a real person and lived about this time period. So we're now getting historical chronology that matches to the biblical chronology. And again, there have been skeptics since the Bible's been around, that have tried to prove that God's Word is not accurate. There was no Queen of Sheba until they got out there with their little shovels and dug up a coin with the inscription to the Queen of Sheba. All right? And so there's never been anything. So we have these types of information, and all of them, while not given to tell us how old the earth is, give us an indication that it's not that old. Well, then there's science, folks. There's lots of science. There's the evidence from the moon. Do you realize that if the earth and the moon are 4.5 billion years old, which the geologists say they should be, or that they are, we shouldn't be able to see a moon. There is something in astronomy called the Roche limit. And that simply says that when you've got an object in orbit around a body, that it's under the influence of its gravitational field, that given time, the orbit slowly decays. It gets closer and closer. Gravity keeps pulling that orbiting object closer and closer. Just like if we have satellites in space, the International Space Station, they have to boost that thing into a higher orbit about every 18 months. Means that if they don't, it's going to be pulled faster and faster by gravity. It's going to get closer and closer, and it's finally going to burn up. They have to keep pushing it into a higher orbit, because its orbit decays. Gravity keeps pulling it down. Well, the moon, now, it will do one of two things. If it's too close, the gravitational pull becomes too great. Guess what the moon would do? Guess what the object would do? It's going to be sucked into the gravitational field, and it's going to finally collide with the Earth. If it's too far away, guess what happens? If we put a satellite out there and we put it out too far from the gravitational pull of the Earth, what's the satellite do? Off it goes. We should either not have a moon, or if it's 4.5 billion years old like the Earth is, or it should have crashed into the Earth already, and we should have rings like Jupiter. Jupiter and Saturn both have rings. Okay? But the fact that we have a moon says that it's not that old. Can't be that old. The astronomy of it says it's not possible. Well, the craters on the moon, the number of craters, they've actually studied this. And the number of craters, if the moon was 4.5 billion years, should have a vastly larger number of craters than what's there now. Moon dust, that's a questionable one, because moon dust is just atmospheric dust that's in space all the time, settles down, does the same thing on Earth. But on the moon, there's no wind or water to blow it away. And so the concept was that when they landed the Apollo astronauts on the moon, that if it's 4.5 billion years old, there may be 20 feet of dust there. Well, and they actually, and I've read differing accounts. I don't know which one's the right account, but my understanding that one of the accounts says that the astronauts that were flying the lunar lander had control. They didn't want a computer landing that thing because they wanted someone to look out the window. They put a big long pole so that when that thing came down and touched, they wanted to be sure that it touched something solid and didn't sink into maybe 10, 12 feet of dust. Now, well, if it didn't hit solid, then he could put it in reverse and go back. Okay? Now, again, there are several different stories that some, oh, no, that never happened. Well, we don't know for sure. But we know that the amount of dust on the moon was about a half an inch. Just what you would expect if the Earth is, maybe 10,000 years old. Not very much. Short period comets, the fact that we still see comets flying around the sun in what's called short period, that's less than 10,000 years, means that, again, every time a comet goes around the sun, it gets sucked a little closer, a little closer, and a little closer. Now, if it's billions of years old, guess what happens? They burn up, they eventually end up in the sun and are burned off. Well, the fact that we have short period comets still, like Halley's Comet, comes around every 76 years, Kohoutek, and so on and so on and so on, okay, says that these systems can't be that old. Well, the evolutionists, but there are places where comets come from, called the Oort cloud. Well, we've never proven that the Oort cloud has ever produced a comet, but well, that's where we think that's why we have short period comets. Again, remember you can take all of this evidence and support what? Both of the worldviews. It's not something that's going to prove either or, because if we had one piece of evidence to prove that God did it, and there was no other possible conclusion, then God just forced us in believing us, He didn't give us a choice. And God loves us enough to give us choices. Well, let's move on. Shrinkage of the sun. Sun's getting smaller. Other astronomical gravity, supernova remnants, and we could talk for the rings of Saturn. The fact that if the Saturn and of course Saturn and the Earth and then all the other planets, even poor little non-planetary Pluto, okay, came supposedly from the same interaction of the sun's material. Well, the fact that Saturn has rings, those rings are just particles of dust that should have been pulled in by the gravitational pull of Saturn if it's billions of years old, just like the sun supposedly is about 7 billion years old. And so those planets should have been, that dust should have been pulled in long ago. The cooling rate of Jupiter and Saturn, the winding up dilemma, that refers to the spin on the axis. And all planets, so they all spin. Some of them spin counterclockwise, some spin counterclockwise, some spin this way because their axis is pointed that way. And how do you get that if they all came from the same location? Something splashed into the sun, and this molten material splashed out and then started spinning and cooling down. They would all be spinning. The laws of angular momentum would have caused them all to spin at the same direction rather than some reverse, some, and some upside down laying on their side. That's called the winding up dilemma. There's a whole bunch of stuff involved with that. Well, we can look at the Earth. No fossilized meteorites. You can dig in the ground, you can't find fossilized meteors. Okay? The decay of the Earth's magnetic field. This one's huge. We know that the Earth's magnetic field that holds us down, that keeps our atmosphere on here, it's weakening at a certain rate. And folks, if the Earth's been here 4.5 billion years, we shouldn't have a magnetic field now. At the rate of decay since it's been observed, we should be without, and so we'd have to have lead boots on to keep us from floating off into space. Obviously we don't. At least I didn't see anyone coming in with lead boots on. The decay of the Earth's rotation on its axis, it's slowing down. It's like God, maybe, I compare it to one of these old, again, going back to my Stone Age upbringing, the old wind-up mainspring clocks. You wound those things up and you set the time and then you set it down. And what did it do? Tick, 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 tick. And about 3 or 4 days later, what did it start doing? Running slower and slower and slower and finally stopped. Okay? Guess what the sun, the Earth, the solar system, the universe is doing? The exact same thing. It is running out of energy, just like that mainspring clock. The volume of lava on Earth, we could talk about, there are literally, I think, 89 or 90 different young Earth scientific evidences. The minerals in the ocean. Minerals in the ocean come from, you have to remember that water supposedly came from comets. These little balls of solid ice that float around the solar system from time to time, striking the Earth. Supposedly that's the source of all our water on the planet. Every drop of water came from a comet. Well, when they got here, there weren't any minerals, supposedly, and all the minerals have washed off the land. Well, if it's been here 4.5 billion years, then surely the ocean should be like the Dead Sea. You can't drown in the Dead Sea. Well, suppose you could. But you'd have to work hard at it because the Dead Sea has so much salt in it that you bob up and down like a cork. All right? Because of the high mineral content, all the oceans should be that way. The thickness of topsoil, we know the formation rate of topsoil. We should have much thicker topsoil somewhere on the earth. There's the comets added to the earth. Let's see, what else we have here? Well, the erosion of Niagara Falls, that's another big, long explanation. But the fact that it's where it's at says that the earth hasn't been here this long because it would have been, I think, 70 miles further north or something at the rate of erosion. Irregularities in the strata, these are the places where we see strange things that have happened. Missing strata. Polystratic fossils, those are fossils that are standing across millions of years of so-called geologic time. You have a tree trunk that's standing upright, and here's 10 million years, here's another 10 million years, here's another 10 million years, and so this tree stood there over 40 million years without rotting. Well, we all know what happens to a tree out in the woods. And it falls over, gets stuck in mud, it rots. Okay, it doesn't become a fossil, it doesn't wait for another 10 million years to go by and get another 6, 8, 10, 12 inches of mud over top of it. Well, woolly mammoths, the fact that you can go to the Explorers Club in New York, I think it's every 3 or 4 years, and they will fry you, if you remember, a woolly mammoth steak. They are so fresh that they cut them off of the woolly mammoths as they melt out of the glaciers in Siberia, and the meat is so fresh that you can fry it up and cook it. The wolves eat it all the time. And so the fact that those supposedly animals, 10 to 50,000 years ago, are still so fresh that they can be eaten. Oil and gas deposits, we're still drilling oil and gas deposits down the ground. Geologists, oil and gas won't stay in the ground forever. It's always coming to the surface. Always coming to the surface. 10 to 12, maybe 20,000 years is the maximum time at which oil and gas will stay in the ground. And yet, over in our part of West Virginia, they are drilling gas wells for what's called the Marcellus Shale and the Utica and the Ithaca, and they got all kinds of shales that they're drilling to get gas for, and they're still able to find pockets of oil and pockets of gas. And it simply shouldn't be there if the earth is very, very old, so indicating a very young earth, not around very long. Chemical deposition. Too little sediments for what we find. Okay, it takes less than 1 billion years. Okay, there are 25 billion tons of sediment going into the ocean every year. That's dirt, mud and rocks, etc. Okay, less than 1 billion tons leaves by going down under the continents, by subsidence. Okay, the process that you get continental drift, the continents move, this is sliding this way and this one pushing over, and so that layer of sediment is disappearing, being put back into new rocks. At that rate, given the amount of sediments in the ocean, it would take less than 12 million years to accumulate the sediment we see on the bottom of the ocean. And remember, geologists need 4.5 billion years. Well, actually, they want more than that. They've asked for more than that. So why does the world look old? Where did that come from? Okay, so why does the world look old? Okay, number one, what did the original world that God created look like? Anyone know? Did he take a snapshot? Nope, we don't know. Okay, what are some of the features that we see there at the time? Well, we don't know. Did God create the world with the appearance of age? Absolutely. When God created the world, if Adam went out and cut down a tree, it would have had rings. It had layers. It would have had to, because that's what we see. Now, which were the original layers and which may have been because of catastrophic events like the Genesis flood? We don't know. Or other catastrophic events. Okay, the appearance of age. So if Adam had cut down a tree, when he was 2 days old, the tree would have been 4 days old. Would it have had all of these growth rings? Shake your heads up and down. Okay, trees that need growth rings can't survive without them. That's how they transport water. Now, as you get back closer to the heartwood, that is dead. But these layers out here are still transmitting and conducting water. That's xylem tissue. Absolutely essential to the transport of water and minerals up to the top of the tree, so the tree had to have them. Now, would that have fooled Adam? Would that have fooled Adam if he'd cut that tree down 1, 2, 3, 4, 500? Well, God, I just got here yesterday. Okay? It had the appearance of age. Adam was not a 1-minute-old baby when he was created. He was created with the appearance of age. He was an adult, able to follow God's commands and be fruitful and multiply and so on. So, the evidence of age, we talked about that. Things sometimes look old. That's another story completely. There have been lots of catastrophes that have happened. Mount St. Helens being one. Look at the details about what happened when Mount St. Helens erupted. Just astronomical. It changed the landscape so much that geologists who went there couldn't wrap their head around the layers of rock that were produced. They produced a miniature or a little Grand Canyon, they call it. And basically, the geologists went there and they looked at all these 150-foot layer with multiple layers of newly formed rock and said, this happened in 6 hours? Normally if they were to come in and date that, that's 1 million years for each 1 inch. Well, that's 4.5 million years old or 4 billion years old or whatever. But because it only happened in 6 hours, and I actually have a quote and I didn't put it in here, but they actually said we have to rethink how we date these things. Well, then there's the channeled scablands, which is an area in Washington and Oregon that it's the big evidence for the greatest flood, which we have geologic evidence for. And yet it wasn't the flood of Noah. Okay, it was something else. The nonconformity, of course, there's great deals of things missing from the Grand Canyon, as we talked about, as much as 1.2 to 1.6 billion years of time. And here's what I was referring to earlier. In 1856, the Earth was, according to that dude, 18 to 22 million years old. That was a scientist. This is how old the Earth is. In 1862, Lord Kelvin said, well, it's between 20 and 400 million years old. Wonder how it got older that much. 1887, George Darwin, that was Charles Darwin's grandfather, 56 million years old. 1900s, 100 million years. 1911, 1.6 billion years. Boy, it's getting old fast. 1956, 4.5 billion years old. Okay, now, guess why is that? Why did the Earth all of a sudden get so much older? Now, one of the things that happened in these last, remember, when did the theory of evolution first start becoming popular? Well, about the time of Charles Darwin in 1850. All right? So, if evolution, they're now developing this theory that requires what? Long periods of time. So what do they have to start doing? We better find some time. All right, when I was in school, when I was in the 60s, it was 1.8, 2.5, somewhere in there, billion years old. Now it's 4.5. It's not going to be there for long. They're pushing for 8 billion years because evolution doesn't happen fast enough. We should be able to see evolution happening before our eyes. Something should be evolving this second, and it isn't. All right? And so they keep looking for it. This is called the radical change theory of science. The age of the Earth is a matter of interpretation of the scientific evidence we see in the world around us and how we view that evidence. All right? So as we look at the Earth, Christians do not need billions of years. Theists, those that believe that God created, don't need billions of years. The Bible gives an impression of a recent Earth. All right, 6,000 to 10,000 years old is the best you can get. We don't know exactly. All we know is that the evidence doesn't appear to be for the vast eons of time necessary for evolution. And so we're ready for some questions. Here, Warren, you can carry questions. Anybody? Somebody? Nobody? They're ready to go eat, Warren. You mean you're going to make us wait? You better ask some questions or we'll not get out of here. Yes, Kenny. How do they explain the sun? What do you mean by explain the sun? That's because of our rotation. We rotate around the sun. That's because of angular momentum, because of the way, the evolutionist is going to say, because whenever the sun was first forming, it was throwing off bits of pieces of junk and stuff that became, Mars, Jupiter, Venus, Earth, and so on, that started the spinning, and we started also making the annual rotation around, 1 year of rotation around the Earth. around the sun. And so it's the turning of the earth on its axis. That's the angular momentum that would have been caused by the original evolution of the sun. God put it in motion. The evening and the morning were the what? First day. Were they 24-hour days? What's a period of light and a period of darkness today? That's a day. So God not only told us what a day was in Genesis chapter 1, but he defined it. And when he put the first day, the second day, the third day in Hebrew, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but Hebrew scholars tell me that always means what? A literal 24-hour period of time. Okay, yes, sir. Bits and pieces. My talk there was not specific. The information about the Grand Canyon, about the age of the Earth, small bits and pieces of it. But I only had 40 minutes, and I had to cover everything from biology to thermodynamics to geology. So all I did was just sort of hit bits and pieces. And if you'd like to hear that presentation or are able tomorrow during, I don't know which hour it is, one of the 3 sessions I'm presenting tomorrow, I'm actually going to give the Oxford Roundtable presentation. Yes, sir. What are the paths of the sea mentioned in Psalms chapter 8, I think? Psalms chapter 8, they are the what do they call them? I don't know. I'm not into oceanography. My brain isn't on oceanography right now. The North Atlantic Gyre, okay? The Gulf Stream, those are the paths in the sea. We actually now know that the ocean, while, for example, in between the United States and England and Spain and Africa, there's a big counterclockwise circulation of water. But just below that, there's another layer of water going the other way. Okay, these countercurrent mechanisms. So there are actually paths. Literally, they put submarines down at those levels, and they'll drift the opposite way as the currents on the surface. And so these are the paths of the sea that the psalmist revealed. And according to modern oceanography, Matthew Murray Fontaine was the oceanographer who discovered those. And he got the idea because he was sick. His son was reading to him from the passage in Psalms. And he said, I wonder what that means. And supposedly the story goes he went out and started investigating and found these currents, these North Atlantic Gyre. Southern hemisphere has its own circulation pattern. It goes counterclockwise. So, and again, there are layers of paths, okay, layers of directions of water happening in the ocean. Good question. Other questions? Stanley's back. Millions of years, right? Right. Took to form it, right? So how come we have it 3 inches tall now? Actually, at the bottom of the Washington Monument, its monument is limestone. Limestone erodes, chemical erosion of acid rain draining down the sides of the Washington Monument. There are stalactites that are over 4 feet long, that according to normal geologic time periods, a couple million years to form, and yet the Washington Monument, 17 something, or I don't know the date on it, but it's not millions of years old. So yeah, that presents real problem. And of course, they answer that by saying, well, there's been different rates of deposition. Okay, and then so if it supports their case, fine. It's going to be this many millions of years to get this to get this stalactite or stalagmite. If it doesn't fit, well, we'll just oh, that's not important. That doesn't mean anything. So, yeah. Yeah, biblical methods, right? Like I said, it's amazing. And you have to understand, the poor docents, the tour guides, they're simply reciting what they've been told to say. They're not geologists. They don't understand, and I don't, I know just enough to make me dangerous, folks. Okay, but chemical deposition and chemical weathering and those sorts of things, yeah, it occurs at differing rates, and it certainly doesn't take billions of years or millions of years to form these things. Other questions? We out of time yet, Warren? Whew, man. Warren says you're not eating pizza until, I guess that's what we have, until you ask some questions for 10 minutes. Anything in either session will be fine. I'll be happy to address that. Again, we will be talking about the dinosaurs in a little bit, and that's after lunch, and then the Genesis flood, which is also going to answer some geologic questions. I think it's going to sort of address that as well. Yes, sir.
Are you willing to answer a Neanderthal?
Well, you can ask anything you want about Neanderthals.
So on NPR Thursday, I was going down the road and I got listening to the radio, and they said have chronic hay fever, rhinitis, that somehow they've been able, scientists have figured, they've been able to find the DNA in human, modern human Neanderthals. Now, the DNA of folks that have this cyanitis problem, they can go back to Neanderthals, and that's where they're finding this. And I thought, this is very interesting.
Yeah, the question about Neanderthals and who and what they are, of course, we don't really know. We know biblically that at least in the Old Testament we have, there were giants in the land. Neanderthals apparently, were larger, than normal humans from that standpoint. But I'll say this, that if you look at just looking at the structures that we have of the so-called Neanderthals, larger skeletons, heavier bones, heavier brow ridge, across the eyebrows, I'm thoroughly convinced that if you go to virtually any NBA team in this country today, and if we had the skeleton of one of those 6'11", 7-footers, their features, their skulls, their bones are so much larger that if we buried them, I'm almost guaranteed that they would be classified, or as Neanderthals, or we could dress them up in regular street clothes and walk them down the streets, and no one would ever look twice at them. Wow, that guy's tall. Okay, so like I said, the Neanderthals has almost completely been removed. Number one, from anything having to do with man's evolution. Okay. Again, they say, well, it was a race of people that that became extinct, that died out, and why they had to have bred with the quote unquote true human beings. I hadn't heard that. That's but how they could get to the point, I guess, obviously doing some sort of DNA study off of the bone marrow DNA to say that they could say that's where. So we're sneezing all the time, were they? I have to dig around in that a little bit. That's kind of interesting, but and I'm not sure what the significance would be other than to say, well, that's why we have hay fever. I'm going to blame my Neanderthal cousins, I guess, because I have seasonal sinusitis. All right, I have hay fever. So, hi, Warren.
David, I have a comment.
Oh, we're in trouble now, folks.
Not nearly as authoritative as you are.
Well.
And I was looking for a bookstore or something, and they were talking about the outcome of some conclusion. And I'm going to say DNA, but don't quote me. That they had said, how they did it, I don't know, that supposedly modern man has DNA from Neanderthals that, don't quote me
Well, yeah, and I think that's, you know,
There's nothing different, so-called Neanderthals and modern men.
yeah, and I think that's, you know, the question of whether Neanderthals are a different race of human beings, that has been almost totally been, you know, they are humans and could interbreed with quote unquote modern man. And, you know, there's no question. If you look at biblical examples of the Philistines, I mean, how tall was Goliath? 9 feet. You know, I can't even touch 9 feet. I mean, I've got long arms and I'm tall. Okay, but they could, they could, take wives of, and they did take captives of countries that, the Israelites and, and other nations that they conquered and took. So they were able to interbreed and produce offspring, which means that they're humans. Okay. Now we know that genetic isolation, when we isolate a group of anything and let them breed in very close proximity to one another, and that has caused a lot of the race development. Okay. The Chinese racial features and the Scandinavian features and so on. It's because of genetic isolation that happens. When we start mixing them all together, we come back to the Heinz 57 of humans. And so I think that it's very possible that those quote unquote Neanderthals, which were very advanced, they buried their dead in ceremonies, and they had jewelry and flowers and had great respect. I mean, these weren't cavemen, folks. They may have lived in a cave, but there are still people doing that, so don't give me that means they're less than human just because they decide, nice and warm in a cave if you've ever been in one, okay?
I can already say, just two questions. One is you go to Africa, Zulu nation is way over 6 feet. You just go just a few miles or not too far away and you had the,
Pygmy tribes, yeah.
pygmies, the Hottentots, the Sioux, anyway, the small people. And just recently we discovered the hobbits out in the Pacific. They're only like, so they're all human beings.
Yeah. There's no question that when it comes to the evidence of man's evolution, the only thing we can say is we don't have any evidence of man's evolution. All right, the so-called ancestors have come and gone. Nebraska man turned out to be the tooth of a giant warthog, and that's all they had was the tooth. And they didn't even dig it out of the ground, and yet they created a whole man out of it. Piltdown man, excuse me, and from England was a total forgery. I mean, total forgery. Doctor took the jawbone of a human, or excuse me, a human, filed the teeth off and took the humerus, the upper arm bone of a chimpanzee, treated them with chemicals that made them appear older, took them out and buried them, and 2 or 3 years later went back and discovered them. And the entire scientific community bid on it, hook, line, and sinker. I've got entire books from the early 40s and 50s that Piltdown man, that's man's evolutionary link with the the lower apes. It turns out to be just an absolute total hoax. So there you go. Other questions? Now, how are we doing on time? I'm getting hungry, Warren. Oh, Warren says we can stop now. Whew. Yeah, Warren's in charge now.
Now, all right, technically we're going to eat